This is Kevin Haroff, and I am welcoming everyone to a special meeting of the Larkspur City Council on Friday, February 26th, and we are beginning at 9:03. And I hope there are members of the public who are able to join us, but I'm calling the meeting to order at this point. So can we have a roll call of attendees for the council?
Councilmember Paulson.
Here.
Councilmember Way.
Here.
Vice Mayor Hilmer.
Here.
Mayor Haroff.
I'm here.
And Councilmember Kandel is absent.
Yes, and he let us know that he would not be able to attend today. So with that, I think we'll just get started with the meeting and go to agenda item number 2 right off the bat, public comment. This is a time for members of the public to address the City Council regarding items that are not on the agenda for this meeting or that are listed as part of the consent calendar, which we don't have today. So if there are any members of the public who would like to address the council on items that are not on the agenda, this is the time to do so. Do we have anybody?
Our first public comment will come from Bob Pendoli.
Okay.
And Bob, you may unmute yourself to provide public comment.
Good morning, Mr. Mayor and members of the council. My name is Bob Pendoli, and I'm representing the Marin Environmental Housing Collaborative, or MEC. MEC is a countywide consortium of advocates building support for projects and policies that advance affordable housing, as well as environmental integrity and social justice. As you meet today to consider the short and long-term values and objectives for the city, we ask that you keep in mind the well-being of low-income and at-risk households. We strongly encourage you to explore all measures to protect low and moderate income tenants and homeowners, including mobile home park residents, from eviction and displacement during this pandemic. The goal should be to keep people safe at home by decreasing economic stress on those who have lost income due to the pandemic, and for those on fixed incomes whose finances will not flex to accommodate additional expenses. We strongly encourage you to allocate staff time to exploring the feasibility of enacting a temporary rent freeze for Marin Park and potentially other parts of Larkspur, and to place this topic on an upcoming agenda for consideration. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for those comments. Appreciate it. Anyone else, Allison?
I'm looking for any further raised hands in our audience members and any emailed public comment. And there is no further public comment.
Okay, well then I guess that will conclude the public comment section of today's meeting, and we'll move on to agenda item number 3, which is a strategic planning workshop, which is the principal reason we're having a meeting today. This is an opportunity for the council to discuss short and long-term values and objectives for the city. We'll be receiving presentations from city staff, but we will not be taking any specific actions with respect to the items that we'll be discussing today. So with that, I think we'll turn it over to our city manager to give us a start out. Dan, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Mr.
Okay.
Mayor. A few housekeeping items to start. The council each year meets generally in February to conduct a strategic planning session, and they take various formats each year. This year we've elected, because we think it's more aligned with the way the Zoom format works, to do more of an educational session and offer the council opportunity to provide general guidance and direction for the year ahead. We'll be focusing on 2 major topics, and I have a working agenda that I'm going to put up on the screen for you now that Mayor Haroff and I had an opportunity to discuss. We will be doing a financial update, and we will also be reporting out some of the revenue options we've been studying at the direction of the council from last year. And then we will spend some time discussing the year ahead in terms of housing issues, the housing element, regional housing needs analysis, and other key issues. We know that there's a bit of a time constraint for some of the council members, but as time allows, we're going to update you on the initial work staff's doing in the area of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then we'll have some open time for general questions from the council. As is our practice, the strategic planning session starts with opening comments from the mayor. So at this time, I think we can dispense with roll call and introductions. We've already noted that the council's here, other than Councilmember Candela, who couldn't join us. I will note from the staff side, you have your city attorney, Sky Woodruff, assistant to the city manager, Shannon O'Hare, and your planning and building director, Neil Toft, and of course, your city clerk, Allison Fallis, are all present. So, Mr. Mayor, I'm going to let you take it away with opening comments.
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to do that. I want to make sure everybody can hear me on the audio. Welcome, everyone. This is an unusual exercise that we're going through. I've been on City Council now since except for 7 years, and every prior year we had the opportunity to get together at these annual planning sessions in person over coffee and pastries, and with members of the public also always welcome to attend. We can't do that this year, so the structure of our discussion today will be a little bit different than I think what we're all accustomed to. We have a number of things that we want to go through, mostly to make sure we're all well informed about the status of city activities, finances, and other matters. But this is a workshop, so I'm hoping that those attending today will feel free to participate in whatever way seems comfortable to everyone. As a general point, I'm very proud of our city. I think we are a leader within Marin County and Northern California as well, in terms of the management of our finances, in terms of our administrative capabilities, and in terms of the collegiality that those of us who are on the council and have been on the council for some time share. That's always been a hallmark of our city council, and I appreciate it, and I think others throughout our community respect that. And I know they do, because I've heard that from a variety number of people. So I think we're going to go through a series of presentations here today. One of the things that I discussed with the city manager that's important to me personally, and I hope we have a bit of a conversation about that, is as leaders in our larger community, to continue to advocate on behalf of diversity within our community and initiatives that we can take to make progress on that front. So that's a personal goal of mine, and I hope we have a robust conversation about that today. But with that, unless other members of the council want to contribute something at this point, we'll turn it over to Dan.
Okay, and let's see any hands. I did also want to note, for the benefit of the audience and the council, we are experimenting for the first time with a closed caption program. We bought that for the city Zoom services because many of our library programs, we were hearing there were folks that would prefer to have a closed caption option. So we're beta testing it here as part of this workshop. You should be able to find a way to turn it on if it's not.
No, it's
rolling at the bottom of the screen for you already.
It's on. It was a little confusing when I started to see it pop up, but it's there and it's on its way. Good.
Good. So I'm going to be the first presentation and give you a financial overview. So I'm going to go ahead and share my PowerPoint with you. Hang on one sec.
There it goes.
Yes. Okay. Oops. Okay. So it's been my practice to open your strategic planning session to give you a sense of where I see the city finances. This year, you're getting a preview of your mid-year budget discussion that's going to happen in March. We normally don't wait as late as March to do a mid-year budget discussion, but as the council's well aware, there's a 2-month lag before we start to see sales tax data. So we are only just now starting to see the holiday season sales tax data. And it's so critical to some of the decisions that we want to make this fiscal year that we understand what happened during the holiday season. So we have held off a little longer on our mid-year budget. But there are some themes we can talk about today. So taking Dan's temperature on the city's financial picture, if we go back to June, I would have called it cautious pessimism. I wasn't very confident in where we were headed. I think I told you numerous times, I hope I'm wrong. It's one of those rare times when I'm gonna say that I really wanted to be wrong. And why was I cautiously pessimistic? There were predictions of a national recession. Obviously, we had the COVID-19 restrictions on business occurring, and we were experiencing civil unrest. What a difference a half a year makes, though. My temperature's changed quite a bit as we enter into February. Now I'll say I'm cautiously optimistic about our city finances. And some of the reasons for that, the local recession's been very limited in scope. We have seen, if you drive around town, you do see this, we've lost some businesses, but as a whole, Marin's been fairly insulated from the recession that's occurring nationally. The other big issue is internet sales have been overwhelming, actually, unprecedented, as you might expect. With businesses closed locally, people have turned to online shopping. And because in Marin, I don't think, at least in Larkspur, we experienced the downturn in the economy the same way the entire country did. Those internet sales have been very robust, and they've shored up losses that we experienced locally. And then I'm hopeful that the stimulus bill will pass and will contain federal relief for Larkspur. That's in the latest iteration, but as the council's aware, that is a discussion going on in Washington right now, whether local agencies should receive some of the stimulus money. My optimism, as always, is quite relative. So in this case, one of the things to keep in mind is, as we go through this presentation, revenues are trending very well, but they're trending well against the adopted budget. So that means revenues are doing better than Kathy Orm and I thought that we would see. But we cut pretty hard. So these are not revenues back to pre-pandemic levels. Sales tax and hotel tax will need probably several years to return to pre-pandemic levels. Our sales tax consultants think that we won't see pre-pandemic levels of sales tax revenue until 2025. It's hard to know about the hotel. It really is hard to predict what's going to happen there. So let's talk about our main revenue streams briefly. Property tax, we budgeted $10.6 million for this fiscal year. Through January, we have $6 million in the bank. That's about right. We typically see 55% of the property tax come in the December payments, and then about 45%, oops, that's a typo, I should say 55% of our property tax comes in the December collection, and then we see the rest in the April collection. So slightly above where we would expect to be. So that's good news. And that's been a trend the last several years. The assessor's very good at predicting what the property tax will be, and usually under predicts by a little bit. So right on target. Sales tax has been our pleasant surprise. We budgeted, gosh, another typo, I apologize. We budgeted for $1.62 million in the sales tax for this year. I think that's actually the right number, but it's the right number without any consideration for internet sales. And we see that in the data coming through. Through January, we've received about $1 million of sales tax revenue in the general fund. Now, remember what I said earlier, we're about 60 days behind in collections. So this doesn't reflect the holiday season. So we can be cautiously optimistic here that we're doing pretty well. That said, while I think we now are trending toward having over more than $2 million in sales tax revenue by the end of the fiscal year, there are some things to consider. One is we don't know about the holiday season, and two is there's what the state likes to call its true-up process now in May and June. The state changed its methodology for how it sends sales tax to local government. They use a system where they predict how much sales tax came in, and they send that to the local agencies to help us with our cash flow. The problem with their approach is their models are built on looking at the year prior. So this year they're using a pre-pandemic projection to send you a check during the pandemic. And so we last year experienced a true up in May where we actually had a month where we didn't receive any sales tax from the state because they were correcting for having overpaid us or advanced us money. We think that'll probably happen again this year, so we have to be prepared for that. All that said, I do think sales tax revenue will exceed the 1.6 that we put in the budget. That's a really positive thing. And why is that happening? As I mentioned, most Larkspur residents would think have maintained their income levels and spending patterns. And they've just shifted where they're spending their money, moving more of it to online and delivery. And as I said before, we didn't really budget for online sales. It's been our practice for the last several years to be monitoring online sales tax as the state has sort of wrestled with how to collect online sales tax and then send it down to local municipalities. The state now has a fairly defined way they're going to do that. And as I mentioned to the council in a recent meeting, essentially all the sales tax generated online that's attributed to the county is sent to Marin, and then it is paid out to the local municipalities proportionate to your participation in the local sales tax base. That, in simple terms, comes out to Larkspur gets about between 4 and 5% of sales tax collected on sales in Marin as a whole. And so that number is going to move constantly based on the local sales tax that we're generating, but we can feel pretty comfortable that we probably won't dip below 4% ever of the county pool system. I don't know how long the county pool system will last. We're reaching a point where the internet knows where they're sending all the goods and services, so they ought to be able to just send all Larkspur generated sales to Larkspur. I anticipate that in the next couple of years, this is going to be quite a discussion in Sacramento. But based on the way the state collects the money now and the limitations of its own computer systems, this is the way they're distributing the money at this time. Going forward, Kathy and I have developed, now that we have enough data, a plan to begin to incorporate the online sales tax into the budget. So you'll see it projected as part of your future budgets. The other thing we've mentioned is we're only now realizing the full impact of the Wayfair decision. I've given you sort of a convoluted explanation of the Wayfair decision before. I had somebody explain it really cleanly to me recently. When you go on Amazon, you're buying goods from either Amazon itself or often from a third-party vendor that is selling through Amazon. In the past, Amazon did not take any responsibility for making sure a third-party vendor collected sales tax from you. So when you went on Amazon, sometimes you weren't paying sales tax or you weren't paying the full sales tax locally. Now that's all been changed. Wayfair is a website that works similarly to Amazon. And so a key part of this decision is now most online sales are being taxed. And as a result, we've seen a sizable increase in sales tax revenue online. So we are trending ahead of budget, and that's something we can be pleased about and feel some comfort as we think about our budget projections. So bottom line, pre-pandemic, we were starting to approach $3 million in base sales tax. I think for the next several years, 2.4 million is probably a more realistic number for us, and that is aligned with the projections from our sales tax consultant, HDL. So that is challenging for us because certainly that's a gap that we'll have to wrestle with. But that said, we've never budgeted to bring in 3 million. We were enjoying a surplus for a few years. We've actually budgeted in the 2.5 to 2.8 range in the last few years. So in terms of how we operate, we never expanded our services to match that $3 million level. So that's good. Our prudence in that regard will keep us sound.
And it's Kevin. Just a quick question. What's the analysis that supports going to the $2.4 million range?
So HDL, our consultants, work with a database that looks across the entire state and various segments of the economy and what they think the growth factors will be in those segments over the next few years. They take that and then they apply it to the activity they're seeing in the current year and in past years to start to come out with a projection of where they think we'll land. Kathy and I took a different approach. We analyzed the base sales tax in Larkspur itself at the cash registers in Larkspur. And then we applied a rudimentary projection of what we think the internet sales tax revenue might look like for the next several years. We also land in this general range. So we're both fairly comfortable that at least for a few years, this is probably the right general projection for our sales tax.
Okay. All right. Well, that's what it is. So thank you.
Right. And again, this is a projection where I'd love to be wrong.
I understand.
In a good way.
No, I understand. Thank you. Thank you for that explanation. I appreciate it.
Sure. And of course, for us, a great mystery right now is what's going to happen with our hotel tax. How quickly will the hotel sector and the tourism sector in Marin recover? We slashed our budget hard in anticipated revenue to 160,000 based on the data we had when we were building the budget. I suppose the good news is we actually are doing better than that. We will come in above budget in hotel tax. So that's good news. We're trending ahead of budget. Bad news. Let's not forget, before the pandemic, we were bringing in $900,000 in hotel tax. So this is even if we finish around 200,000, we've taken a massive hit in this budget area. And this is the biggest hole I see in the budget for the next couple of years, is waiting for the hotel tax to recover. We think probably based on early information we're seeing, HDL provided us some tourism sector analysis that it'd probably be realistic to see some recovery, and we would end up in the $400,000 to $500,000 range of revenue for the next few years until tourism truly comes back. Now, one thing that may be a glimmer of light for us in this area is the fact that the Marriott in Larkspur Landing has often done a lot of business traveler work in addition to tourism. And so that may bolster their occupancy rate. And just a reminder, we historically take 1% of our TOT revenue and we put it in a fund to support local businesses. So that's where we're going to really hurt, is having the availability of money to support local business isn't going to be there until we see the recovery. It's not going to be there at the levels we were enjoying before the pandemic. Just really quickly on fee revenue, we've been pleasantly surprised with building fee revenue. It does look much stronger than expected. We're going to be working with Neil's department to do some reconciliation. It gets a little challenging to fully understand building fee revenue until we get closer to the end of the fiscal year, because we take in a lot of deposits and then we charge against those deposits. So figuring out what the net revenue to the city is a process in and of itself. Planning fee revenue has slowed, but we are doing cost recovery, so we're protecting the general fund and the city in planning. Public Works fee revenue has been meeting its cost recovery goals, so we're fine there. We've been decimated, obviously, in recreation, but the cuts we did in recreation have offset those losses. So that's sort of a wash at the end of the day for the general fund. That's, of course, the discussion going forward is how much should we subsidize recreation to provide services to the community, recognizing we may not be able to generate as much cost recovery offset as we like to. My general thoughts, I'm pleased to report, I think we're in a much better financial position than we expected to be. I think we need to now transition to implementing a plan to restore services as much as we are able to, recognizing the constraints of the pandemic and this year of sort of recovery in the pandemic. I think it's key that the savings we realized in the community services department be retained. And that means we probably are looking at making that a permanent arrangement. We had initially described that as an interim arrangement, but I think it's clear that for the next several years, that model is part of our recovery plan. Next steps, if December sales tax follows, I'd like to talk to you about lifting the furloughs early. And that's as much about service levels as it is recognizing the hardship to our employees. If we end the furloughs, we gain 8 hours of productivity per employee back. I can tell you that that will be money well spent for the community. Losing a day of productivity has been a challenge. And so that would be one of my highest priorities. Thank you for approving in February our request to add some help in the library. The modified service in the library has astounded us in how demanding it is. People are really enjoying the library. I think in some respects, they're busier than they've ever been. It's just different than the way they were doing it before. And then Neil and I are in the midst of assessing what should happen in planning and building and what our cost recovery model can help us afford. We actually lost an employee this week. He resigned to take on a better opportunity elsewhere. So we wish him well, but we now need to sort of figure out what that means for the staffing and planning and building. And then we have to sit and wait and not make any other key decisions until we get to that May and June true up. So we really know what the sales tax bottom line looks like for us. So what I think is most likely going into the next fiscal year is the frozen positions will probably, for the most part, stay frozen as we sort of navigate all of this. And so the biggest hit there is probably in recreation, where we'll probably maintain a very minimal approach for another year while we sort things out. And that brings me to the end. As I said, hold the line. I did want to note, the council's aware of this. The council became part of a joint powers authority that promotes trying to create more affordable workforce housing by purchasing existing apartment buildings and then trying to stabilize their rent. It's a very interesting model, and part of the way it works is to reduce the costs that go into the operation of the apartment complex. The JP ended up purchasing Serenity, which is a large complex out in Larkspur Landing, and 6 parcels have essentially become publicly held parcels, and they'll come off the property tax rolls. So we're waiting to see the final numbers on that, but the loss to the city annually will probably eliminate whatever gains we made in property tax in the past year. But as I've told some of the council members, you need to think of this as an expenditure on affordable housing and workforce housing, because you've chosen to participate in a model that over time has a lot of potential to keep rents in this property flat. And also after 15 years, there's an option for the city to acquire the property itself, which opens the door to a number of workforce housing options. And then we do have some uncertainty in our business-to-business sales tax sector. Larkspur Landing Circle, a lot of folks don't know, but those office buildings have a number of businesses that sell products to other businesses. And there does appear to have been some instability out there caused by the pandemic, and we're monitoring that closely so we get a better sense of what that means in terms of our base. The really positive news, though, is I don't think we'll have to draw on our reserves the way we were talking last May. I think the draw now is probably going to be more in the magnitude of $500,000 at the most, and that's actually considerably less. I think we were talking to you last year, well over $1 million to draw off of reserves. If the federal money materializes, this probably is one of the things we talk about, is using it to preserve our existing reserve balances so that we can continue to invest in capital. And then the long term, and after I take questions, it's a segue to Shannon's presentation, is, how are we going to do all of this and ride out the economic effects of the pandemic while maintaining the quality of life enjoyed by our residents? That's the challenge. And we're going to talk about the revenue side of the equation after I take questions from the council.
Thank you, Dan. That I mean, obviously there's a couple of ups and downs in that presentation, but overall it's very encouraging. I remember when we had the conversation last year and you expressed yourself as pessimistic. I think we were all kind of down about what the prospects for the future might be. We're doing much better than I think any of us anticipated, and there are a variety of reasons for that. So I'm grateful for our community personally for continuing to be energized and economically viable, and appreciate your efforts and Kathy's efforts to keep our finances going forward. Thank you. Anybody else in the council?
I see Councilmember Way has her hand raised.
Yeah, good.
I'm trying to use that raised hand emoji, I think it is. I had 3 questions. First of all, are you seeing trends in the sales tax that's changed in the pandemic? For example, we used to get a lot of sales tax from the gas station. With people driving less, they may be drinking more. So now are we getting more from the cost plus BevMo area? Are we seeing trends like that?
So we did see an increase in alcohol sales, and we were already enjoying robust alcohol-related sales tax revenues. You're correct. We've always actually had a very nice revenue stream from our various gas stations, and that has been considerably less during this period. Again, I think that 1.6 number is probably the right number. And if you think about it, that's a drop of 30 to 40% in the base locally. What's going on is that you're seeing all the internet sales tax come in to shore up those losses. So we're gaining in one sense, right? Because we're seeing a new stream, but it's masking some of the effects you're asking about. They're definitely there. Yeah.
My second question is in regards to the JPA for housing that we participate in, which involved the purchase of the Serenity apartment complex. Do those numbers then affect our RENA allocation?
No, because those units already existed.
Okay.
So RENA, and Neil will educate you later today about that. That has a lot to do with bringing new units online.
Okay. And how many units are there? I can't recall. Was it 160 or something?
That sounds about right.
Okay.
Neil probably knows the exact number. Share that with me, but that sounds about right to me.
Okay. And I just want to echo also what Kevin said. I think your early management analysis early in the pandemic last year in March and April to make some significant but very difficult staffing cuts and reallocation of some of our resources, and pulling together our ad hoc committee that we could help analyze some of our financial limitations, I think was just a key reason why we're doing well now. So I really appreciate that you took the initiative right away to take some hard decisions and ask us to make some hard decisions, to let go of some of our most admired staff, just to be able to keep the city going. So that's my comment.
I see Vice Mayor Hilmer has his hand up.
Yeah, go ahead, Dan.
I really wanted to express a similar appreciation that Catherine very nicely stated. But one question I have is, over the last year, if you could, as the city manager, is there a very simple way to describe the impact this has had on the city? Or is it too complex to say that we took a hit that basically cut us in half and now we're back at 75%? Or how would you best describe very simply the impact that this has all had over the past year?
Do you mean in terms of our internal operations or the outward?
Operations.
I would say that the biggest challenge is the same challenge everyone's experiencing in all of their business life, which is there is an element of productivity that's facilitated by in-person contact, and Zoom can't replace. And we've struggled, and I would say where that materializes for us is in the analytical work we do for you. And I think part of it is because one of the things our staff does is we get together and we spitball stuff and build up an analysis for you. And that's a better experience and a better product when we're together. Because the council authorized us to spend a lot of money on technology early on in the pandemic, I think we fared better than a lot of smaller agencies in becoming nimble and responsive electronically. We still have a ways to go. We're about to transition our phone system to a more responsive product. But it's actually been transformative in a positive way to issue every staff person a laptop. We're seeing changes in the way our staff works that overall I think have actually been quite positive. In terms of just pure straight operations, I think recreation, it's been hard for me to watch recreation be limped along and so unresponsive to community desire. And that's even recognized in the pandemic, even understanding demand changed and opportunity changed because of the pandemic. We still just can't, in this constrained environment, help people get out of our facilities what they want in terms of recreation. But we're doing the best we can there, and I can't say enough about the staff work.
Thank you.
Anything else from the council? And again, Dan, thanks very much for that report. To me, it's very encouraging, recognizing that there have been challenges over this past year, but I think we're in a good direction going forward. Just a kind of a nitty question. Do we have a sense of how many of our city employees have been able to access vaccines?
Well, none of the none of the existing Larkspur staff, I think, has yet reached a qualification for vaccine. Yeah. All of our public safety personnel and our two joint powers authorities have had the vaccine made available to them. Okay. Not all of them have elected to take the vaccine, but the participation rate has been higher than in a lot of other agencies, which I think says a lot about our two chiefs speaking about the benefits of the vaccine. Our participation rate in fire has been very high, which is great because if you think about it, they're definitely experience a lot of exposure on a daily basis. So.
Yeah, no, of course. Well, hopefully that that overall scenario is going to improve over the next few months as the vaccine becomes more available to a wider group of people.
I think the discussion, I participate in a weekly briefing with Dr. Willis, and I think next week we'll begin a discussion about what's the timing for the 1C tier. Most government employees are going to be in the 1C tier, and so we'll start so that we can plan participation for our employees appropriately.
Okay, that's good news. Any other comments from the council before we move on? So let's go on to the next part of the program.
Okay, so we're going to transition to talk about revenues, and I'm going to turn it over to Shannon O'Hare, assistant to the city manager, who's been doing the work analyzing our options, having taken direction from the committee of Mayor Harrop and Councilmember Way. So Shannon, turn it over to you.
Okay, let's just turn on the screen share here. All right.
There you go.
I can see my screen. All right, great. Good morning, members of the City Council, any members of the public listening, and any people of the future who are watching the recording. My name is Shannon O'Hare. I'm the assistant to the city manager for the city of Larkspur, and this morning I will be talking to you about revenue options and revenue streams. So the background, why are we discussing revenue streams? It seems like certainly every time we discuss the budget, a mid-year budget and adjustment, that we're continually bringing up revenue streams, even as we've continued to ask a lot of the public in terms of new sales tax measures, new initiatives, asking for cuts in service during this time, et cetera, asking to deal with cuts in service during this time. The short answer, and it may seem a little bit obvious, but I really think if you don't live and breathe this stuff every day, this can't be taken for granted because people are busy, right? Like all of us here are public servants. Some are donating their time to the community, others it's our profession. Investing in our community costs money, and providing services to our community costs money. And I'll get into this more as the presentation goes on, but Larkspur has a number of current and upcoming unmet needs that will cost money. So in the city manager's presentation, in addition to talking about some of the challenges, one of the things that was highlighted was how much our community not only appreciates the core services, public safety, improving our roads, et cetera, but all of some of the things that legally are not required, but are very much appreciated. The library right now is more appreciated maybe than ever. People are, very disappointed and upset that we aren't able to provide, including us, we aren't able to provide recreation services the way we want. So if you have unmet needs and you don't want to cut services, and it seems at least that the community at large doesn't have any interest in cutting services more than we have to, looking for additional options to fund our needs is what we will have to do. So the slightly longer answer to this is that we have made significant progress catching up to some of our unmet needs, particularly deferred maintenance, but there's still work ahead. So when we hear deferred maintenance, especially over the past few years, you've heard both from the city manager and from our public works director about our roads, our storm drains, our bridges, et cetera. But there's also other kinds of maintenance. So you've heard from our fire chief at our JPA about deferred maintenance on some safety preparedness, on vegetation management, as well as some new best practices. That's all maintenance and maintenance of our community, not only for safety, but for quality of life. Additionally, we have new mandates and new conditions that will require new investment. So every year we get a whole new set of laws and a whole new set of expectations, a lot of times things that are expected of us, and we don't necessarily receive a blueprint about how to carry that out or funding to support that. And I do want to say a lot of these mandates and a lot of these expectations are not necessarily bad things. So an example we bring up frequently is our storm drains. The amount, what can now pass through a storm drain, or what will be in the future, is something that has to be smaller than a cigarette if it's going to go into the bay. That's a huge change in a mandate and how our infrastructure works. That's probably not a bad thing. It's a good thing for humans. It's a good thing for the health of the bay. I'm sure our animal friends appreciate it who live in the ocean. These aren't necessarily bad things, but they will require new investment. And also we will be seeing new conditions. So in the past few years, part of this also has to do with deferred maintenance, but a number of things are changing. Our communities are growing, the way people commute's changing. And then certainly if you look at things like climate change, what we can expect in the future in terms of wildfire conditions and in terms of rainfall, both in terms of drought and then increased precipitation for flooding. Those conditions are expected to change in the future, probably to some degree for the rest of our lifetimes. And then the next point is it's not prudent to count on special funding from regional, state, or federal entities as consistent or meaningful sources of revenue. That's not to say that we don't get any funding from the state or any revenue from our regional partners, from the state government, or from the federal government. It's just that conditions change. I've now been in local government for over 10 years. And so I'm old enough to remember redevelopment and when that was a meaningful source of revenue for a lot of communities, and things change, right? And a lot of times things don't change necessarily that are favorable to local government receiving money directly. Sometimes they do. We've heard about the city manager talked about the Wayfair decision. That was a certain funding mechanism where we didn't know that we'd require that we get that kind of revenue, but we can't rely on that. And we certainly can't always rely on that to favorably work out for Larkspur. We're a small community. We don't know what the funding formulas will be. So the best way to be fiscally responsible is to fund ourselves before we expect anyone to help share the burden of that. And then finally, and I just always want to say this in every presentation, the city has a history of fiscal responsibility. Certainly this council, previous councils, the community, that's always been one of our bedrocks of how we serve our community and how we do business. And so new investment and expanded services will require new sources of revenue rather than doing things like eating into our reserves or not funding certain things, if at all possible. Further background, so the city's already created a number of new revenue streams to maximize things and help us in our ability to raise additional funds in a number of areas. So we had Measure C and then Measure B. We already have sales tax measures. This isn't exactly a revenue stream, but we've refunded some of our pension obligations so that the actual amount of money we have would be greater than if we had continued with the way we had done business. And then additionally, a few years ago, we did a fee study, which the purpose of that exercise wasn't only to raise funds, but it was actually to make sure we were charging the correct amount for our fees because we only do cost recovery. We don't make money off of most of our fees. Although for us, we did see increased revenue in a number of areas. We were actually undercharging for staff time and what's the legal rate. And then I also wanted to highlight that relative to the challenges other local governments are facing, Larkspur's fiscal health is very strong for a number of reasons. Again, the decisions we've made, we have a very strong tax base relative to some other communities. Certainly, people all over Larkspur, I don't want to minimize that people have different economic circumstances and conditions, and we should always keep that in mind. But when you look at the aggregate, we have a strong tax base, and we've also done a very good job of living within our means, if you want to use that, that kind of terminology or that analogy. And we have a lot of needs. Some of them have already been discussed, but if you want cold, hard numbers that are very high, here are a few of them, really in terms of needs. So we'll need storm drain replacement and improvements at cost estimated at $17 million per the storm drain master plan. This isn't only because of new mandates that are coming, this is also because of deferred maintenance. Even if nothing changed in weather conditions or what the state mandated, we would still need to replace our storm drains. If you ever look at some of the old presentations, we have pictures of our storm drains and it makes its own case. Additionally, 2 of our fire stations, the Greenbrae station and the downtown station, have very high short-term needs that we need to address, as well as high long-term needs in order to make those stations kind of the modern stations and work as best they can. And then City Hall has a long-term need of $8 million. We've already invested in a number of short-term needs. A few years ago, we did some upgrades to City Hall to address some of our short-term maintenance, but the long-term needs in order to bring it up, do some seismic improvements, as well as some other improvements, just maintenance on an old building. These aren't small numbers. So I will be talking about 3 potential revenue streams, and staff has identified these because these are really the 3 that would bring, I don't want to necessarily say like the most amount of money, but would make the most meaningful amount of contribution over a longer term of time. There's other ways, there's other potential revenue streams that are a lot smaller, but I want to focus on the big picture today. So one is sales tax. The basic statewide sales tax rate is 7.25 and is divided following 6% goes right to the state, 1% to the local jurisdiction, and it can be, the way that actually gets distributed can be pretty complicated and varied, so I won't go into it. And then there's an amount that goes to a local transportation fund. In Larkspur, there is an uncaptured, or there's an amount that's below the maximum of a 4th cent sales tax that would provide an additional revenue of $600,000 if we're in conditions like we are now with what HDL, our consultants have projected, or if we were at our high point in sales tax revenue, would be closer to $800,000 a year. So this is not a trivial amount of revenue that this would create. The pros to a sales tax is that historically, Marin voters have been receptive to sales tax measures, particularly in the past few years. So San Rafael expanded a sales tax. I believe it was Measure R at a 1/4 of a cent for 9 years in 2018. Measure F, Corte Madera also expanded their sales tax. They went from a 1/2 cent to a 3/4 cent rate to capture a sales tax, and both were passed by voters. And then at some point, this revenue will likely be captured by another agency. So the city of Larkspur is not the only agency with needs or who's looking at ways to maximize revenues. I'm sure at different retreats and different meetings, staff at our partner agencies are having similar discussions. So this wouldn't, in my mind, this wouldn't be something where if we were to go for the sales tax, it would necessarily mean an increased cost to the community. At some point, I think the community will support some agency for some kind of sales tax measure to fund something. So there's a strong case that we have these needs, why not us? Very compelling case of core needs. And then a pretty technical point, the city receives a larger amount of the revenue generated from local sales tax measures than from the base sales tax rate. So the amount of money we're recovering right now from Measure B is more robust for internet sales than that 1% we get from the state. For complicated mathematical reasons I won't go into now. But it's actually a more stable form, even in downturns, than just our regular sales tax. So that's also something to keep in mind. Considerations, they're not cons, but they're considerations as we look at these things. We've already asked our voters. Originally we had asked our voters for a smaller sales tax that expired after 5 years. And then we went back to our voters again and asked them to tax themselves at 3/4 of a cent without expiration. So we've gone to the voters a couple of times already. And then conventional wisdom, again, if there are any economists watching, economists love conventional wisdom, but they also love to argue with each other. So this is just a broad statement. Conventional wisdom is that sales tax is sensitive to both economic contractions and changes in the business cycle. And I really want to also highlight changes in the business cycle. The city manager talked about, even though Marin is doing fairly well relative to a lot of the country and the state and even the region, in our economic conditions, changes in the business cycle can affect us almost as much as a recession. So if business to business changes, or people decide in Marin that they don't want to drink, I'd be surprised. But if BevMo goes away or something, that can have a very significant effect on us, even if the overall health of the economy is strong. So I also just wanted to show how the sales tax is broken down right now. So we're currently at 9%. So I've talked about the state. I've talked about what we've done. There's a few other agencies that also have sales tax. Some of these expire, some don't, but SMART has a sales tax. The Open Parks District has a sales tax. We get some of that Measure A money. It's funded actually a lot of our parks improvement. We get a small amount of that, as well as TAM. And we also see some of that TAM money. But to my point that at some point, another agency will likely go out for a sales tax, and if there's a compelling case, the voters might support that. I just wanted to kind of provide that illustration if you don't know the various sales tax on your receipts off the top of your head. I know I don't. And that kind of closes out the sales tax. If there's any questions right now, I can take them about sales tax, or we can move on.
Shannon, just one real quick, that this is Kevin, unless, is there anyone else on the council would like to ask a question or comment?
I have a short question.
Go ahead, Catherine.
Shannon, a couple of years ago, I remember in one of our legislative meetings, there was discussion that the state might be raising the cap from 10% to 12%. Is there do you have any information on that, whether the 10% is being talked about to be raised?
I believe it's always talked about being raised in terms of that, whether there's something. And I also think that we can go up, correct city attorney or the city manager can jump in if I'm incorrect off the top of my head. I believe it can go up to 10.25% for certain kinds of tax, right? If you add a certain kind of transportation tax in some kind of scenario, but it's not at 12%. And at least what I've seen this legislative session is there's not a bill that has broad support and is being pushed right now to raise the sales tax. And that doesn't surprise me because the state as a whole has plenty on its plate, and a lot of local businesses, folks, et cetera. I think they're really focusing on a couple of core legislative priorities, as well as getting us out of the recession and getting us out of COVID.
I think that's true. I mean, you sit on the MCCMC legislative committee, and what did they say? They were introduced something like 2,400 bills were introduced this year alone to begin with. So that's a heck of a lot of bills to go through. So, all right, thanks.
Anyone else from the council? Dan Hilmer?
You in the pros, you seem to list kind of a summary of needs, where you have dollar amounts attached on the previous slide that was up there.
Oh yeah, so the 600,000 to 800,000 projection.
Well, actually, when I started to ask my question, it was the slide that was on the screen at that point. Yeah. It says many needs including, and then it goes through a pretty good summary, $38 million in essence. Am I to assume that the reason that the storm drain infrastructure improvement amount is not included with this listing is that would be a separate strategy for implementation?
Could I ask a clarifying?
Revenue stream option?
Sure, what you're asking, Dan, maybe you could try. Are you asking why? I'm not sure what you're asking. You're
providing us information that would inform us in looking at alternatives to financing these various packages of city needs. In addition to those that are on the screen listed now, we've got the storm drain challenge that has to be funded. Would we be going to two distinct identified activities for funding? One, would infrastructure have to take a separate funding strategy than what I'm looking at on the screen now?
So and if I'm not completely answering the question here, I'll get back to it and try to answer it as best I can. So, and I actually neglected to mention this on my slide. If there was a sales tax, so there's actually more technical things for members of the public who might be listening in. There's a couple of different ways. I'm not sure if this is what you're referring to, but you can do sales taxes. So one is you can do a general sales tax, and you can certainly call out what you would spend it on and talk about priorities. So for Measure B, it's a general tax, although we have a Measure B oversight committee, both in how the funds are allocated, but we've committed as a city and you've committed as a council to spend X amount of it, particularly on road improvements, et cetera. You can also do a special tax that would require 3/4 of the voters to approve it, which is a very high threshold and also limits suitability as needs change and as projects are completed. I don't know if you're talking about different storm drain costs than I have on, I believe it's on the screen, that's estimated 17 million.
I apologize. What I mean to ask is, are we going to look to finance a $38 to $40 million cost need package? Are we going to try to do that all at once?
Oh, okay. So this is I understand the question now. Thank you for the clarification. And I'll let the city manager add to this as well if he has some thoughts. Right now, we're talking about revenue streams that staff would pursue further in terms of both how we'd message it to the community, how we'd identify things, and exactly where it would go. That was actually on my next step slide. So that work hasn't been done yet. And in terms of a package, the sales tax would be year to year, and potentially we could bond against the sales tax projected revenue, but it wouldn't be put in as, I don't believe there's any discussions, at least among staff yet, that this would be some infrastructure package where we put all these three things together. My Am I further from the question now? I feel like I might be.
I think, Dan, this was only provided for illustration.
Yeah,
it wasn't intended to link need and funding strategy together yet. You know, this presentation today is to remind the council of the different options that are potentially out there that we think have some viability. The next discussion would be prioritizing the need against the different options and making decisions about what we want to talk to the community about if we want to have that conversation. And some of this need may be redefined. Now that we have Central Marin Fire, we've been talking with the Corte Madera staff about jointly funding an overall needs assessment for the fire facilities, which may eliminate this need and define a new one. And so we'll need to have that number to have a cogent conversation going forward. But these are your adopted 2050 plan numbers. And so it's just a reminder of what sort of jump out as big needs that folks don't always realize are out there. I think folks don't think a lot about storm drains until water's backed up around their property. So we want to make sure that doesn't happen to folks and remind them that that need is looming out there.
And are you putting these in any sort of priority at this time?
No.
It's illustrative.
No, the council's made a strong statement in the past that the 2050 priorities aren't in a specific order, in part so we can remain prepared to react to funding opportunities that emerge. I mean, I could list them in my priority order, which is going to be liability based since I'm your risk manager, but there's also other variables to put into play. So.
Would you like to share that with us?
I think the storm drains are a most glaring need for the community. I think now that we are in the final stretch of our initial repair of our roads, that conversations about storm drains will probably dominate our infrastructure discussion for the foreseeable future. As the council knows, City Hall is a difficult conversation until we resolve where the library is going to be. And as I said, the fire stations, you know, we may need to look at a joint solution with Corte Madera for fire service. And we really need an expert to come in and tell us, should we both limp along our 4 existing stations, or do we need something else to do the job that our community wants?
Okay.
Thank you.
Does that answer your question, Stan?
I'll follow up. Thank you.
Okay. And just as a reminder, the current sales tax measure does include storm drains as something that can be addressed with those funds. So that's something that the community already has accepted. I guess the one takeaway I get from this conversation is that we have an opportunity to maybe increase our sales tax revenue for the benefit of our community that we may want to consider taking advantage of before somebody else does. And that may be just figuring that out is I think a priority for us. I'm sorry, Shannon, go ahead.
Oh, last thing about storm drains, because there are a bunch of people on staff who are probably better positioned to talk about storm drains than I am. But in terms of some of these things too, it's not an exact parallel. But when we look at these unmet needs, I think the other thing is some of the needs are the magnitude of them are more than people understand. So we've already been addressing some of our storm drain needs when we've been repaving our road. But if we think back to when we did Measure C and we were repaving our roads, part of why we went out and we expanded and had Measure B, the successor measure to it, is that if we only had 5 years or we were just funding as we went and we weren't able to bond at it, things would get better, but we would never fully improve our roads the entire way. And I think the storm drain situation isn't an exact parallel to that, but it's not that far off in terms of we can make improvements when things break. That Measure B, those Measure B funds are really important to us. But in order to fix the whole system and really modernize it, there's an opportunity there if you had additional funds that aren't there right now, the same way we were when we were doing kind of pay-go with Measure C. That's all we talk about storm drains.
No, but that's a good conversation to have, and I think that maybe not one we have to pursue today necessarily, but something that we ought to put on the list for further conversation.
Right. So I'll move on to another potential revenue stream, which is parcel tax. So parcel taxes are, I'm not going to go through the exact machinations and stuff as much as sales tax. It's pretty straightforward. It's a tax on the property owner's bills. And Larkspur could go out for a parcel tax. It would be the appropriate vehicle for the services it would fund, particularly if we were asking for something like new facilities, either jointly with Corte Madera, if we decide to go in on modernizing, replacing whatever a study may show for our fire buildings, et cetera. That's an investment in the community that very much makes sense for property owners to be the investors, whereas sales tax, all kinds of folks contribute to our sales tax, including visitors and folks who work here, et cetera. That's why I also brought up the Green Bay Fire Station long-term needs of these. I listed them again. And then the considerations around parcel tax is that I will show you a list of, Marin already has a number of parcel tax, and a lot of our partner agencies very much rely on parcel tax to fund the services they provide. The entity of the city does a lot to make our community a great place, but our school districts are also invaluable in terms of quality of life and investing in our community, and rely on parcel tax as a mechanism to partially fund them. And historically, Marin voters have been a little bit less receptive to property taxes, parcel taxes, partially because we already have a number of significant parcel taxes. It can be a little bit of a harder sell to make a case for another big line item on your property tax bill. Sales tax, not always, but there's the perception that it's a little bit more dynamic in terms of discretionary spending and how much it costs, versus if you're on a fixed income or you came into this community under certain conditions and bills just keep getting added to your property bill. So these are example of parcel taxes on a typical Larkspur property tax bill. Any property may look a little bit differently depending on what district you're in, school district, kind of where you are in the community, but there are already a number, when people get their bill, they already see a number of things. And when you look at these, when I look at them both as a professional and as a community member, these are all very worthy causes, right? These are all good things to be funding, but there are already a number of them, and some of them are larger than others in terms of actual cost. But we already have a fair amount of property taxes in our community, and that's the discussion on just straight up property tax as an option. So if there are any questions about that. It's not quite as lengthy as what the other two portions of this this presentation will be. Are there any questions?
Question for the mayor.
No, Catherine, go ahead.
You do have a Q&A from the audience. I don't know whether you would like to take that later in the discussion, or just take a look at it and see.
I've read it. It's an expenditure question, so I'll take it up after we finish the revenue.
Okay, and so lastly, I'll talk, but probably the least familiar with, something called real property transfer tax, which is different than a parcel tax or straight up property tax. So real property transfer tax is a fee when a residential or commercial property is sold from a buyer to seller. Who pays it is generally negotiated between the buyer and seller of the property, and the cost can be incorporated into the mortgage on a residential property, and it's usually paid by the developer as part of a new development. In general law cities, of which Larkspur is one, the transfer tax rate is set by the state, and it's currently at $110 per 1,000. If you actually look in the code, I believe it's 55 cents per $500. Same thing. Unlike general law cities, charter cities may set their own transfer tax rate. Real property tax transfer rate. And there's been a trend in about the last decade for cities to become charter cities for the express purpose of setting property transfer tax. And there's a number of different ways to set your own property transfer tax. Sometimes cities allow for a portion of the transfer tax to be waived for seismic improvements, energy efficiency upgrades when a property is bought. Oakland recently changed their property transfer tax rate to have it be graduated based on the amount of the transaction. So there's a few different ways to do it. On this table, to provide an example, I have the revenue that Larkspur currently gets as a general law city with a real property transfer tax rate at $110 per 1K, and then what El Cerrito's rate is, where it's $12 per 1K. And $12 is around $12 is a typical rate for a charter city to set. And the difference in revenue is pretty stark in terms of that. So the pros of the real property transfer tax is it's a one-time tax. It's not a continuing obligation for property owners, unlike a parcel tax. Who pays it is determined between the buyer and the seller of the property, although in an in-demand market in Marin, I would guess that the buyer would often be picking up the bulk of that fee. And the transfer tax itself is pretty straightforward and a steady source of income and low maintenance. Once we've set this rate, we collect the tax, and it's not a lot of work for staff in order to collect that revenue. And property values in Larkspur have remained very strong throughout multiple economic recessions and contractions. Some considerations is that although the transfer tax rate, property transfer tax is pretty straightforward, it will require the city to become a charter city, as well as the fact that there's only so much property in Larkspur to transfer. We have a limited amount of parcels, and so it's unclear at what rate property will change hands in the future. It will continue to change hands, but in the past few years, we've actually had the number of resales has been very high. We don't know what those rates will be in the future. Just some background on charter cities, since it's how you set your property, you can set your transfer tax rate. Most cities are general law cities. As of January, there were 125 charter cities. The difference legally is that a general law city has the authority to act locally, but it must be consistent with the California Constitution, state statutes, state administrative regulations. A charter city also has to follow all of these laws, but they have the additional authority to adopt laws regarding municipal affairs. Legally, municipal affair is an evolving concept that encompasses elections, finance, planning and land use, public contracts and prevailing wages, and employment and compensation. And I put here that that's with significant caveats. So when our planning director, Neil Toff, does his presentation on land use, and you wonder if we could completely change some of the decisions that are made and decisions that the state has made around what we can do in terms of land use. These laws increasingly, charter cities, it's considered a state interest. And so charter cities, the laws apply to them the same as they would a general law city. So again, it's an evolving concept, but it's much more narrow than one might think. And there are a few examples of local charter cities in the Bay Area. We have a few of them. So the process to become a charter city, you develop a charter committee develops one for council approval to be placed on the ballots. It needs to be approved by a simple majority of voters. And anytime the charter is amended, it also must go back to the voters. The council can't make that decision. No other governing body can make that decision for the charter to be amended. And some cities have very complicated charters, and others, it's a pretty straightforward document. The cities that have opted to become a charter city for transfer tax purposes, a lot of times the charter will say, we obey all of the laws and regulations and all of the conventions of a general law city, but we'd like to set our own transfer tax. And then in some of the research I did and asking folks at different charter cities, et cetera, if it's a simple charter, it would not have a significant impact on how we conduct business as a city every day or how residents experience their community. And so really the most complicated part is explaining what a charter city is when it goes onto the ballot. So I won't read this, but it'll be in the notes of this presentation, it'll be up for public view. The language for a ballot measure to say that we want to completely change a charter, completely change the way we do things for the sake of a property tax, that requires a lot of explanation. It's not an intuitive concept for folks. So it's a lot of work to become a charter city and to ask the community to make that change.
Shannon, can I ask a question? Just that committee, the charter committee that is formed, what is that comprised of? Is that community members or just city council members? What is that committee?
There's a couple of different ways you can actually legally compose the committee, but it's often a mix where you'll have X amount of city council members and then members of the community coming together to discuss the charter. And if there's already discussion around it being, you know, the goal for it to be around real property transfer tax, that can also inform the scope of the committee versus, especially historically, charter cities and what you might do when developing a charter and what those conversations might be. But yeah, it's not only council members, it's certainly community involvement as well. And then any other questions before we wrap this up? I know we have lots more on the docket today.
No, this has been very helpful, and you know, I think this is Kevin. I've expressed my own support for going in this direction. This is not an action item for us today. This is just mostly informational at this point, but I hope there's a sense among the council that this is an opportunity that we should take seriously and move forward with.
Yeah. So to that point, Mr. Mayor, so the next steps, certainly for staff, is to determine what avenue for revenue enhancement the city will pursue. Putting all of these before our community at the same time is not terribly feasible. And then any and all options, if pursued, will require going to voters for approval and public messaging campaign to discuss this more. So this is just not something we'd embark right away. There'd be many more community conversations, more in-depth conversations about this. That being said, this city staff is in the process of engaging a community polling consultant to determine community values and priorities. Previously, Larkspur has done election polling that's very targeted about what the feasibility would be for a certain sales tax and how receptive the community is for that sales tax and what purpose that would be used for. Right now, although if we go to the voters, we'll also likely have some election polling. This community polling, it's actually something called the Citizen Survey, the League of California Cities. If you've been on any of their calls, it's occasionally brought up as something cities do. It's really, you don't only poll prospective voters, you ask all of the community about their priorities generally and what they think of for the community. So you don't poll with a very narrow focus in mind. You ask what they think about things like library services and about roads and where that falls on the priority list. And so with that information, once we get that going, staff will start preparing an analysis and feasibility of moving forward, probably with sales tax and potentially a real property transfer tax in the charter city that have been identified right now. So that concludes this presentation. I'm happy to take any questions or hand it off to the next presentation.
Shannon, can you put your table up again with the dollar amounts?
For a real property transfer tax?
Yes, that one. So I just wanted to emphasize for the council, no, that was it. That
was it, yeah.
Okay. So we split the $1.10 with the county. So we get 55 cents and the county gets 55 cents. That's a formula in law. So when you're seeing these numbers that are revenue for Larkspur, it's based on the 55 cents that we take in. El Cerrito gives 55 cents to the county and then gets the rest of what's there locally. So you can just do a ratio if you want to play with this number offline of what different amounts would produce. And that gives you some sense of the potential here of this particular revenue stream.
Hey, Dan, can I ask a question about the table? I think that you've got for Larkspur the amount of transfer tax that you're receiving, but the total value of, I'm not sure what you've got there for El Cerrito, but their real property transfer tax is trending about 2 to 3 million per year. Wow.
Okay. I think we must have picked up the wrong column. Or
yeah,
wrong
you might have an apples and oranges thing there.
So we'll publish a corrected table. But for comparative sake, I think San Rafael's transfer tax is close to $3, $2 and something cents. even that would be an increase in revenue, substantial. But I think there might be tolerance for a different number. So.
Well, this is just illustrative at this point. And
right, that's right. But we'll make sure we illustrate with the correct numbers.
Yeah,
get the revised table.
And fair enough. And this is going to take some thought to work out. But I really, as I said in the past, I'm enthusiastic about going down this path. So let's keep working on it. Any other comments from the council or anyone? And Shannon, or are you all set?
I think we're set. I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen and pass it off to the next speaker.
Okay. Should we take like maybe a 5-minute break? We've been going for almost 90 minutes.
Yeah, and then we're going to try to get you out by noon. So.
Well, that would make this a good opportunity to go.
And there is a question. I did want to very briefly. There's a question asking about capturing more savings on our expenditure side by continuing to do shared and combined services with other agencies.
Right.
The staff constantly is exploring those options. You recently saw we're trying to work out a deal with Mill Valley on a public works inspector. We are currently talking to a number of agencies about possibilities in the building division of our planning and building department. This post particularly asks about planning. We're reaching the point where it's going to get challenging for us to explore combined or shared services unless we start to align our municipal codes. And planning is the #1 challenge. It's very difficult to contemplate combining planning services because the municipal codes and the general plans of the partner agencies are not necessarily aligned close enough where that is possible. Also, planning directors, as Mr. Toff will nod his head right now, serve a commission. So it's really challenging for a planning director to contemplate serving 2 different commissions in 2 different communities. So we certainly look at options to partner in different divisions, but it'll be challenging in ones that specifically administer municipal code and adopted policy. So.
Okay.
Those are good insights. So why don't we take a 5-minute break if we could? Go freshen your coffee, and we'll resume here at I think my clock says it's 10:25 now. We'll resume at 10:30.
All right. I see that the vice mayor's returned. So Neil, we're going to turn it over to you for all things housing.
Okay, and Dan, Vice Mayor Hilmer, are you on a schedule to get out of here in a few? And was I reading that? Are you okay for a while?
I'm okay for a while.
Okay, and I'm recognizing that in preparing for this, the city manager had indicated, council members Kendall and Paulson are fairly new to the planning, to the process, to city government. And so part of my presentation was really a bit of reiterative educational information. I'll probably go through that a little quicker, recognizing that the 3 of you all have had a bit more experience and time working with a lot of these topics. So I'll try to be a little briefer in that way, and we can get to, I think, more meaty issues and discussion. So
yeah, no, that'd be great. That'd be great. And I don't know when Gabe plans to come back, if at all.
If he jumps back on, I'll certainly try to make sure he's up to speed.
Yeah, I don't think we'll have Scott at all today, so
I can certainly circle around with them on questions after this on one-on-one.
I think that's the best way to go. Thanks.
Okay, so and on that, my first slide was going to be a series of acronyms, just to remind the commission of, the council of these words I'm going to be saying now and then and what they mean. I think the one key area here in housing, of course, is HCD and ABAG are kind of the leads relative to the housing issues and the future housing element. And again, one reminder is ABAG, the Council of Governments, is basically the regional planning agency for the Bay Area. And over the last several years, they've merged somewhat with MTC, which is the Regional Transportation Planning Agency and funding agency for the Bay Area, with the intent of trying to align the RTP, the Regional Transportation Plan, with the Sustainable Community Strategy, which is Plan Bay Area, so that both transportation planning and land use planning are done in a more coordinated manner, and that funding goes towards projects that are serving both good transportation purposes and also combined with good land use planning and regional planning purposes. So the only other, I think, acronyms in here that are somewhat new to our lexicon are the transit-rich areas and high-resource areas. These are new designations identified under Plan Bay Area, which are applicable to a number, certainly to Larkspur, as well as a number of other suburban areas around the Bay Area, and have sort of tilted some of the designation for the housing allocation. The other acronym to be aware of is the ODDS, the Objective Design and Development Standards. This is a project we're working on. I'll describe it a bit more later, in order to address the potential for by-right housing for by-right projects for housing development. Okay, just quickly, I wanted to get back, just give you an overview of the general plan update. Of course, we have published the draft general plan and land use diagrams for public comment. The only major change we did from the current general plan, excuse me, I hit the button. The only major change we did was to add a mixed use designation, a new land use designation for the RVSD site. The intent of that is to, while there is a permitted development and entitled development under the planned use designation, the mixed use designation could provide for more flexibility, recognizing there may be some changes to Ross Valley Sanitary District's use of the site and potential development, and I'll discuss that a bit more later. Other than that, a lot more policy work towards increasing flexibility for commercial uses on built sites, unifying standards, unifying the commercial neighborhood area, really encouraging a combination of resident serving uses and mixed use residential. A lot of our housing is going to be realized through encouraging or developing more mixed use residential on commercial or potentially office sites. So we have initiated the public review and the CEQA process. We're in the process of preparing the draft EIR. We've done a scoping meeting and our consultant is engaged with sub-consultants, and we're preparing the draft EIR. And that's projected for new development over the 20-year planning horizon. And in doing this right now, just to let you know, we are looking at our build out scenarios and looking to have the EIR address the potential build out as directed under RENA. We think that essentially the general plan can potentially accommodate the build out under RENA. A lot of the, which as you know is pretty significant, but a lot of the potential for development is tied up in policies and constraints that have to deal with height, parking, other things like that. So there is potential to open up under the current densities and so on. So we're working on that. And that way we may have already accomplished some of our CEQA review towards the housing element as that comes into the fruition next year. So we'll be, over the next few months, conducting informational workshops at the Commission and City Council. And there are a couple steps to this. We have to then prepare, release, and have public review of the draft EIR and the draft general plan, and then come back, respond to comments, prepare and recirculate a final EIR, and prepare the final general plan with any recommended revisions. There will probably be discussion about trying to implement some of the housing policies and goals or programs within the general plan update. What we're attempting to do is get this general plan adopted. There's a lot of other things in here dealing with health and safety, open space, and so on that we'd really like to just get locked into place, and then work on updating a lot of the housing policies as necessary through the housing element process. And that may result in some future amendments to the general plan at a later date as well. So the housing element is one of the mandated elements of the general plan, and probably the most regulated element under state law, with very distinct statutory requirements and legal for updates and legal compliance. In fact, we're not updating the general plan in this, not updating the housing element in this general plan. We're adopting a general plan that's compliant with our current housing element. But we will be then updating the housing element and possibly having to amend the general plan subsequent to that. And again, we are now in the 5th RENA cycle. Our current housing element is for the RENA cycle through 2022. The 6th RENA cycle begins in 2023. And so we will have to begin, and many of the agencies are beginning their programs to adopt their new housing element. And one thing to keep in mind, these RENA cycles, they vary in a few different stages throughout the state. Bay Area is now on, we're approaching our 6th RENA cycle. I believe the Southern California Council of Governments is already in their 6th RENA cycle. So there's, I think, 2-year lapses between various regions in California on how the RENA cycle is applied. So in our current RENA cycle, we had a requirement of 40 very low income units, 20 low income, 21 moderate, and 51 above moderate, for a total of 132 units. That was actually a bit of a reduction from the previous cycle in the mid 2000s, which I think we were required somewhere over 200 and maybe 246 units. I don't remember the number offhand. We've had a number of projects, including the Rose Garden development, which contributed significant numbers, as well as finishing Drake's Cove. So you can see we're well above in terms of our market rate units, but we still remain behind, particularly in our very low income. If the Ross Valley Sanitary District site had been developed within this period, we would have probably met our low, we would be about meeting our low and moderate income through that project. We'd be very close. We also do get to count ADUs and junior accessory dwelling units towards affordability to a various degree, but we just haven't seen those really coming to the table as rapidly as we'd like. So the last few years, I was hoping these numbers would, these affordability numbers would jump up, but it hasn't happened yet. We're hoping there's more to come. I'll talk about that in a bit. So I think you're pretty well aware of the RENA process. HCD has indicated Bay Area jurisdictions must plan for 441,000 units in this next cycle. And ABAG, it is ABAG that then creates the final allocation through their methodology. And I sent you the workup on how that methodology works. And that is now been approved. It's going to HCD for review. And then in spring, they'll release, with HCD's approval, they'll release the final methodology and draft allocation. And then there will be a period of time that RENA will review potential appeals and have hearings on those appeals, and then do the final allocation. The thing to remember, and I know there is discussion about appealing or unless the state decides to reduce or change that 441 number of units, ABAG has the same number to deal with. So any reduction in one community in the Bay Area requires an increase in another community in the Bay Area. So that's where it becomes somewhat of a zero-sum game in terms of appealing the ABAG process. So we're working off the basis that this won't change. These are probably our numbers. And this is particularly important to begin working on this because regardless of these numbers still being in fluctuation or potential final determination, a state compliant housing element must be adopted by December 31st. So we have a little under 2 years to get a housing element in place that meets all the new, complicated, complex state laws and legislation, and also to conduct the CEQA that goes along with adopting that housing element.
This is Kevin. Just a quick question on the appeals process. How do the appeals? How do those work? I mean, I know we're kind of where we are, and we don't have a lot of flexibility. But I'm just curious, what's the administrative process? Is it just an appeal to HCD?
I believe it's just an appeal to HCD. We've had some discussion at directors about whether there's opportunity to talk to, excuse me, it's not to HCD, I believe it's just to ABAG. We've talked about sending opinion to HCD about the feasibility of the allocation. The sense is HCD just wants to see units built, and they will probably not want to engage into the regional debate about how and where they get built. It may be, I think it's more of a matter of HCD is going to tell ABAG that here's what you got to get done, and ABAG is now distributing it. So the appeal is likely with ABAG. From what I understand, it is to ABAG.
Okay. I mean, I'm sure that's correct. ABAG, of course, is just an association. It doesn't have any formal legal status beyond that. So any appeal in that context would not necessarily be particularly meaningful.
Well, and I'll follow up on that because I think it did present an interesting question to me, is that if ABAG is, for whatever reason, I think they have methodology that they probably believe and is likely defensible. But if agencies were to go to HCD with a convincing argument that this just really isn't possible or feasible, would HCD take up that case? If it was very weighted in certain directions, it was potentially unreasonable.
Yeah, no, I guess my question was more, kind of a legalistic aspect to it. If it's an appeal to an association that is only making advisory determinations, I'm just wondering how that works. And maybe Sky, you have a thought about that. I'm not sure.
I actually think that ABAG as a quasi-governmental entity has legal authority. It has been assigned the authority to make the RENA allocations. And so they would be the body to appeal to. I don't know the procedural aspects of that, but I actually think that they were the ones that made the allocation. So
yeah, no, I understand that. I just wonder whether if that's it.
I don't know, for example, if this is partly where you're going, is I don't know how the appeal would be handled, who would be the hearing body, what the formal process would be. But I believe that they are the decision maker.
And whether there's further opportunities for judicial review or anything of that sort.
Right, exactly. I'm sure that there is, but we would have to exhaust administrative appeals, as you know.
Yeah, no,
I just don't know what that process looks like.
Okay, I'd be curious to know.
I just wanted to bring up that the other day at the MCCMC Legislative Committee meeting that we had, there was discussion of a housing accountability office being opened in the HCD, which would enforce local governments to actually build the housing units. And that was, I don't know if you've heard anything of that, Neil, but it was sort of introduced as that this is a concept that might be coming along. We're going to follow up with it with the legislative committee, but that would change the dynamic pretty significantly.
Well, and actually, I think what that would be doing is simply organizing or operationally giving HCD additional resources to enforce what they're already kind of authorized or directed to enforce, because there's a number of state laws that deal with agencies having to, for instance, the Housing Accountability Act, for agencies having to reduce barriers and approve projects to at least minimum densities or the required densities under their general plans and then some. And then when you look at the issues of density bonuses, accommodations, exceptions for housing projects, there's a lot of potential gray area in which a HCD can kind of step in and make determinations on whether an agency is following the law or not. So it may be a method of, on one hand, kind of exercising a bit of authority or a hammer against agencies. On the other hand, it may also be a form of avoiding going to court necessarily and being able to use the agency as an arbiter of any particular action or decision. So there may be pros and cons to that, but even today, we've had HCD staff has been ramping up their staff to be able to manage the housing legislation and do the enforcement. And we've had questions on ADUs where people loop in HCD staff to basically create a three-way conversation on whether we're correct or not in the way we're interpreting our code and the state legislation. So I think this is just the beginning of probably a continuing back and forth process with HCD. And one thing I was going to mention with the acronyms is, years ago when I was a young planner, OPR was the state agency that we mostly had to talk to and deal with. Right. We don't talk to OPR that much anymore. It's all HCD.
That's it. That's interesting. Well, anyway, I don't want to distract from the program, but Skye, if maybe offline, I'd be curious to know a little bit more about where there's recourse for review of these decision-making processes.
Yeah, I can work with Neil to put something together in writing to distribute to the council about what the appeal process looks like.
That would help me at least. Thanks.
And I did note I noted in their timeline, I was a little surprised. There's quite a gap of time where they allowed for the RENA appeals and hearings. So I imagine they may be expecting that.
Okay.
Okay, and as you can see, sorry. So as you can see, Larkspur has been assigned what I might call a record number of units over the next 8-year cycle. Because of a combination of the housing crisis and that the numbers attached, the methodology that ABAG has adopted has kind of added to the percentages of housing, the proportion of housing going out to more suburban areas, as opposed to the past RENA and Plan Bay area, which really tried to focus housing near the jobs, near more much higher densities towards the urban cores and urban areas. And they're linking this to the availability of education, services, transit. So they've referred to areas as transit-rich areas and high-resource areas along Sir Francis Drake Boulevard, Larkspur Landing area, and Magnolia Avenue. So all of Marin has certainly received a much larger share than it had in the past. Many of the suburban communities around the Bay Area are receiving a much larger share. And I'd say with that, even the urban areas, of course, it's a large arena. So they're all taking on larger numbers as well. For us, comparatively, these are large. Our proportion seems much larger, but relative to those suburban areas, they're still pretty small numbers. But within Marin, Larkspur per capita is one of the larger numbers because of the combination of being a relatively small community that has 2 transit centers as well as what are called high resource areas along Sir Francis Drake and Magnolia Avenue. The really concerning number with this is the very low affordability number. Like our last RENA, it's difficult to realize very low affordability. If you include it in your inclusionary housing, then you're kind of creating a barrier to housing production. So I'm really interested in working with our housing coordinator, I'll talk about that later, or consultants, on how a housing element is really going to identify the production of very low units, because typically these have to be done with partnership with nonprofits and subsidized housing programs. And there's some opportunities to do that. I think we're seeing more, but that's a pretty challenging number, almost 300. And just to give you this is from Plan Bay Area. The green is the transit-rich high resource area, which surrounds the ferry and the smart station. And then we see high resource areas along Sir Francis Drake and Magnolia Avenue. So the Larkspur housing element, we've been in discussions with the County of Marin and ABAG and all the agencies through the Housing Working Group and the planning directors. And we're working with the County of Marin and ABAG. It's going to be a combination. The program that we're working towards is a combination of regional and local review and development. The countywide collaborative would essentially develop a workbook or backbone for the housing element. The ABAG and the county are using funding it's provided by the state to do the analysis, the demographics, housing needs, equity analysis, barriers and housing costs. And then we'll be providing a general toolkit of policies and programs to facilitate housing production, recognize equity, housing options, and particularly affordable housing. Local review, what we're going to have to do in our level, staff and our on-hand consultants and our community, will be to refine these policies and programs and also identify our housing opportunity sites and local measures to facilitate the housing to meet the RENA over this next 8-year cycle. And also to prepare the CEQA for adoption with the final housing element. And again, the challenge is doing a housing element that meets the requirements, the statutory requirements as interpreted by HCD. Our last housing element was a fairly, I'm not going to say easy process, but it was not a highly complex process. We were really doing an update to the prior housing element. And it was a fairly conducive back and forth with HCD. This housing element, because of all the new state legislation, because of the housing crisis, is really going to be an entirely new document. And one thing to identify here is there is grant funding. The regional early action planning is funding a housing element coordinator to work with the county and ABAG and us, the local agencies and our consultants, for specific projects relating to the countywide collaborative, the workbook, the general the general outline of a housing element. There is some limited local funding for our work through the REAP program. We have about $20,000 that's that we're non-competitive, and then we've actually I put in an application for up to $100,000, but it's a competitive application. And then we also have money that we've been approved for a local early action planning grant that was last year. We have money approved for targeting certain activities related to working on the housing opportunity sites. And another aspect of this is developing a VMT policy to help assure we can facilitate the housing projects that are identified. And so I'll just go quickly. These are the housing opportunity sites remaining, sort of like carryovers from our existing housing element. Ross Valley Sanitary District site, that was planned for 126 units, 25 of them affordable, apartment style and townhouse condominiums. And that includes hotel and Ross Valley Sanitary Districts on the facilities on the site. We identified the Bon Air Shopping Center as potential for up to 40 units above commercial. Those under our current zoning are rather restricted. Tiscornia Winery site, housing element projects up to 23 units based on low density, single family density, because that's a very large site that goes way up into the hills. But it has a lot of topographical constraints, so it's assumed that any development there would be clustered down towards Magnolia Avenue, which does contain a historic overlay as well. Class sub areas 1 and 2, these are the areas located near the downtown, adjacent to between downtown and the Rose Garden, the Lucky Shopping Center and the Zari sites. This variety of sites allows for up to 47 units or projects 47 units total between these properties. We also, in the housing element, identified several miscellaneous sites through the downtown and north end Magnolia. We did not project a lot of development, but really have had not much more since then. The height of buildings really is a constraint because it just doesn't make financial sense to tear buildings down or substantially remodel just to create one level of dwelling unit above commercial. You really need 2 to 3 to create the financial incentive to do that. Second units, we had projected 16. We have approximately 10 so far. We may end up meeting that number over the next couple of years, and I'll talk about that briefly. But frankly, we could use a lot more if we're going to get anywhere close to meeting our very low income level. So let's see. So that's kind of my discussion on the housing element. And one thing I did want to say while we look at these housing opportunity sites is we're in discussion right now about, because we recognize whatever gets built at Ross Valley Sanitary District or any major project on these sites are probably not going to get permitted until 2023. We're really kind of out of that window, out of that likely window of having permits issued, and by permits I mean building permits issued for development of any of these properties to a significant degree. So we're in discussions with HCD about shortfall and carryover, and whether these units, which were identified as housing opportunity sites, are actually added onto our next RENA, or we may have to implement programs to either improve the realistic capacity or the potential build out of the units, and or apply by right standards and other measures like reduced parking standards and such to have these sites qualify as opportunity sites for the next housing element. There's the housing legislation in HCD has in midstream of this last cycle started implementing requirements that were somewhat punitive to cities not realizing their full housing requirement. And that's one other thing when we look at one other thing to think about, and we'll have to analyze the approach from HCD now when we do report every year is that they expect to see sort of a proportional level of progress in the housing development of communities, which may make sense for very large urban areas where you have housing development projects coming in at sort of a regular pace. So every year you're going to realize 100 or 200 or 300 units. For a smaller community like Larkspur, we've seen housing projects occur like Rose Garden, where we realize, 20 or 40 affordable units, 100 market rate units, and then there's infill housing projects and ADUs between. So it's not something where we're going to constantly have 100 units each year to then meet our total RHNA. So that's a discussion we need to, I think, really resolve with the housing element. So quickly, I wanted to just get into a couple other projects, housing related projects.
Just a short question, Neil. Going back to the opportunity sites, didn't we at one time have a discussion about the, on South Alicio Road, the old convalescent care site that's there that's been abandoned?
Yes, and thank you for mentioning that. We actually, in the general plan update, we're including a program to consider redesignating that site. And that may be an action that could be done. We assume that's an action that may want to be done through the housing element process. But there may be, and again, because we're really kind of behind the 8 ball in terms of realizing this full number of units, that may be beneficial in including that through the housing element process. But you did trigger me. I did want to mention, in addition to these sites, as part of the Smart Station Area Plan, we had analyzed development at a number of sites, and then some of that we had identified potentially increasing densities. But there are opportunities to look at sites, and I think we'll be having to revisit some of those sites and look at how we might do mixed use, whether we want to continue with what we call vertical mixed use, which is right now in our commercial areas, we really mandate primarily commercial uses with housing above it. There may be some approach where we look at more vertical mixed use. Can we look at some of these commercial sites and maybe identify some proportion of how we might put residential, if it makes more sense to put residential on part of the site, as opposed to, primarily having a commercial footprint. And additionally, and with that, I think we're recognizing after the pandemic and with the onset of remote work environments, there's likely going to be some reduction in demand for office buildings. And so there may be some potential of converting office sites to housing. So rather than necessarily just building new development, there may be some potential to doing some conversion as well. So we're going to have to look fresh at not just these sites, but a lot of other sites in Larkspur Landing, along Sir Francis Drake Boulevard. I think maybe look freshly at the CLASP areas and identify, what tools might be effective for meeting our RHNA needs, and doing it in a way that we're really maintaining the character of the community. Things are going to change, but we want to manage that change.
Okay, Dan Hilmer, you were raising your hand, I think.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. This is not directly on topic, but my question is, in attempting to implement these various strategies, does it also make sense to look where you've got properties that are constrained to consider collective parking strategies such as districts or shared parking, or and include that when you're describing the strategies, so that it doesn't look so daunting when you're describing these things and then tossing out that Larkspur's a built-out community, because I think we need to start thinking of how we do it, not how we don't do it.
Right, and I think with that, the probably one of our more significant barriers to development and housing are our parking requirements, and that's long been a mantra for the agencies seeking to encourage housing or facilitate housing, is how to strategize your parking and your traffic requirements to be able to facilitate housing rather than just creating a barrier. And that's a balance. We know that the community, our experience with the Smart Station Area Plan was the development in that area. That because that's a transit hub, it is a great opportunity for developing housing and jobs near transit, but it's also the transit hub for a lot of Marin. And we heard a concern from not just Larkspur, but communities around Ross Valley and San Rafael and Mill Valley that have a concern with the ability to be able to get to the transit. So there's a lot of pros and cons to developing in that area. But I think getting back to your point is our draft general plan does create more emphasis on concepts and adopting concepts to look at shared parking and unbundled parking, not just in Larkspur Landing area, but also along Magnolia and North Magnolia. So that's going to be part of the equation.
Thank you.
Neil, I saw that we had a Q&A pop up. I don't know if you can see that. I can tell you what it is. It's from.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a quick question. Maybe you could just respond to that real quick. Maybe this is a good chance to do that.
Yeah, because the city of Larkspur is looking to retain, currently under the general plan and the housing element, is looking to retain the mobile home sites. So the question was, sorry, I should say this so everyone can hear, is there a reason that mobile home parks are not included in housing opportunity sites? And the reason is because we see these mobile home parks, they are essentially built at fairly full capacity. And the purpose of a housing opportunity site is identifying areas that are either vacant or fairly underutilized, that are opportunities to redevelop or to develop new housing or redevelop the site for adding or increasing the housing supply. And currently the housing element and the general plan recognize the mobile home sites as being a valuable source of an optional form of housing that is fairly affordable relative to typical single family on the ground development. So there are policies that look at potentially redeveloping those properties with the caveat that there would be opportunity for the tenants, that there would not be a displacement. So there would be displacement policies applied to any future project or plan that would then implement redevelopment of the mobile home sites.
Okay, good. The displacement issue, I think, is an important element to that response. So thank you for that, and thank you for the question, Joan. Do you want to just keep moving along, or do we have anything else from the council?
Yeah, anything else on housing elements for now? Okay. So let me just kind of quickly touch on to another project that we're working on. Using Sb2 grant funding, the city has been working with the county and the other agencies on a project for objective design and development standards. So SB 35 is a housing streamlining bill, and a variety of other recent housing legislation is beginning to push cities towards the need to accommodate by right housing projects, which is essentially permitting housing based on standards, permitting development based on strictly on standards and not on discretionary subjective design review procedures. SB 35 actually implements the requirement for by right housing for cities that are vastly underperforming on their housing, on their RHNA needs. We're underperforming to a degree that we're in a little bit of hazard zone relative to projects that might be 100% affordable. But what is important also is that the recent legislation, and as I mentioned, is driving that such that housing elements, in order to carry over sites or to be able to identify housing opportunity sites as being realistic projects, where I guess I put it this way, prior housing elements were somewhat of an academic exercise. The city does not develop housing. We simply would create the zoning and the policies to accommodate development of housing, and without really a strong eye towards all the constraints or the affordability aspects or the financing. The new legislation is really going to require that the housing elements and the site opportunity site identification provide a lot more support or evidence of the feasibility, if not actually facilitating development of the site. So by right housing is seen as a method to do that. And for housing projects which are subject to by right housing, the state does accommodate what are called objective design standards as an approach. So you can have a review process and even a public hearing process to review compliance, but it has to be compliance with development standards, not subjective design concepts, like, not resulting in an unreasonable impact of use or being in general scale with the neighborhood. You need to actually develop standards that say you can build, X big, X size, here's the proportions, here's the things you need. So we've been working on that since 2019 through Sb2 Planning Grant, working with the county and other agencies. And the purpose right now is to create a toolkit for communities to tailor to their individual needs. And the toolkit would identify place types, which are essentially identifying the areas where you have certain building types and certain scale to achieve compatibility with those neighborhoods or those commercial areas. And then there's specifics on site design, treatment along frontages, landscaped areas, driveway, parking, setbacks. It's sort of a form of a mini zoning for site-by-site development. In addition to this, there are standards for architectural detailing, forms, dimensions, details on windows, chimneys, features, and then finally taking that atlas of information and then implementing it into your code, into your housing element and into your code. And for right now, the intent of our odds would be to really develop, not to necessarily say we're developing this for these locations, but we're developing these as a default should we have or end up finding ourselves faced with a state mandated project, housing project. So we would have a default of design, sort of here's something off the shelf that the developer can choose to use in order to build their project, to build their housing project. If they choose not to use this, then they may be subject to discretionary review. This is it's a challenging concept of sort of back engineering, reverse engineering development projects. So they can fit sort of a preconceived concept or design. We have a draft toolkit has recently been completed by the sub-consultants. I'm pleased to say it actually has relied somewhat on a number of sites in Larkspur as exemplar examples of local community development that have been recognized, and as a as sort of a template for some of these standards for form and architectural design. But we now have to begin engaging in a workshop and study sessions to refine this toolkit. And so it complements our community needs and character, and that it meets the applicability within our current zoning standards in our areas. So we do have a website. I'll be updating that soon. I'm going through this approximately 300 page toolkit, and we'll be bringing that to commission and council for some study session, and then hearing review as we refine that document with the consultants. Any questions on objective design standards?
Can you tell us which projects that were the ones that were highlighted?
We highlighted the, sorry, I call it Creekside. It's not Creekside. The EAH project.
Next to Creekside.
Next to Creekside.
Yeah.
The Rose Lane units, the Rose Lane terraces were identified as, for building sort of at a higher medium scale in areas that are sort of adjacent, the transition between urban downtowns and more single family residential neighborhoods. The Blue Rock was used as a template for sort of neighborhood downtown development. Now, mind you, this is not meant to necessarily mimic these buildings. It's really just to sort of take some flavors from these buildings and try to begin coalescing them or applying them into standards that can be implemented. So those were seen as good exemplar kind of developments. And again, some of these are being used as part of a whole group of countywide, sort of a countywide approach at this point. Another project that's underway under the Sb2 Planning Grant there is an inclusionary housing and fee nexus study that's occurring. I've been giving fee information, permit fee, user fees, all the various costs that go into our projects to the consultants. So what they'll be doing an analysis is whether our inclusionary housing requirement is a barrier, because ironically, while we require at least a range of 10 to 20% of housing to be units to be affordable at a various mix, depending upon whether it's for sale housing or whether it's rental. The inclusionary requirement can be seen as a barrier to housing production. I think in our case, in this case of Larkspur, certainly our bigger challenge is meeting the affordability requirement. So I am curious to find out whether reducing that barrier is really doing us a benefit, because we need the affordable units. And I think the community is more supportive of projects that are largely more affordable units or for senior housing or for Section 8 purposes, smaller affordable units, as opposed to building a large amount of market rate housing just to get a small portion of affordability. But that's the issue that'll be tested, as well as looking at revisiting our inclusionary housing fee structure for projects that might actually defer the development of housing or development of portions, half units and so on, if they defer building that and rather put it into a housing trust fund or housing fees. And it includes analysis of nexus fees for residential and commercial development. We know development is expensive as it is, so it's a challenging question, but there are formulas to determine whether a city can justify charging a fee to go towards housing for commercial development. So as you're creating jobs in a neighborhood, you're creating demand for housing. You can charge a fee to help support the housing that's creating. And additionally, for single family market rate development, you're creating need for affordable housing. So there's an analysis of nexus fees for that. Those recommendations will inform our any updates to our zoning regulations currently, and as well as the housing element. Quickly, I wanted to touch on ADUs and JADUs. We know these can be a source of affordable housing. They provide a housing type option, and they can assist property owners with additional income, having somebody else on site, or housing for family or dependents. We've done a lot of updates based on state law to our local codes to really facilitate and reduce the barriers to housing, to ADU and JADU development. We've worked with the county. There was a recent, again, more state Sb2 grant money has funded the ADU Marin website, which is a resource for property owners who are seeking to potentially install JADUs or ADUs, and how to go about doing that, hiring professionals, financing costs, and potentially issues with renting and having tenants. We've also updated our website to provide guidance on our local regulations. We only require a building permit now. We do not strictly require discretionary review for ADU development. A lot of these are, per the state law and per our requirements, are essentially by right units. So we can do it through a building permit unless certain circumstances require, such as removal of a heritage tree, or the unit is such that it doesn't meet the by right standards and maybe triggers other reasons for review, like a variance or a height limit setback issue. But otherwise, we can typically do this through the building permit. And I did send you guys the link to that website. We like to think it's user friendly. We've developed a checklist to go with the building permit. It's essentially you fill out a form giving basic information, and then depending on the type of ADU, you kind of check off whether or not you're providing the adequate kitchen, access, your size, bedrooms, things like that. So we're doing what we can, but we have not seen a significant increase in ADUs yet. We've got a lot of interest. Staff is spending time with people. I think we're going to see an uptick, but we may need to continue to explore what we can do to increase ADU and JDU development within the city. Any questions on that?
Any questions from the council?
No questions about this. I do have to ask, how much more time do you think we're going to?
I'm almost done. I think I'm down to my last two little points.
What about overall, Dan Schwartz, time-wise?
We were aiming to be done no later than noon, so
okay, I'll shut up then.
Okay, so I just wanted to touch quickly on a couple of sites that are currently in discussion. You know, again, these are likely not going to be realized within our current RENA cycle, so we have to talk with HCD about the implications of that. But Ross Valley Sanitary District site is nearly done with their cleanup and certification by the EPA. Their facilities are going to remain in San Rafael, so they are vacating most of their footprint on the site. This is part of the reason we've introduced a mixed-use category rather than locking different parts of the site into different uses, particularly the office use that was dedicated for RVSD. The board has recently held discussions on land use entitlements, as well as the Surplus Land Act. Staff has been receiving and engaging in conversations on from various parties very interested in this property. There's a lot different ideas on whether to really continue with the existing plan, but other ideas on varying the mix of housing, increasing affordability, options for continuing to include or expand upon the hotel, or other options to really create a senior living complex or senior living community that might be a full range of services, from independent care, independent living, up to care facilities and memory care and so on. One of our reiteration on that is that the city really wants to at least meet its current housing needs, if not begin to plan for potential additional housing needs for the site under the new housing element. We'd like to retain, if it's going to be a commercial use, it should retain some commercial synergy, and certainly neighborhood compatibility. Traffic management's always a concern, traffic issues. And access through the site is important, connecting the site to the Drake's Cove development, and compatibility, scale of building and construction compatibility with the Larkspur Landing area. Another project that's currently in discussion that is kind of just bubbled up as of recent is as a result of the Surplus Land Act and executive orders. State of California has identified a 5-acre portion of the San Quentin property as surplus land. It's directly adjacent to the city boundary. And it's being managed through the Department of Government Services. They've issued an RFP, and they're working with the Department of Housing and Community Development. Their intent is to eventually hand the project over to HCD, and this is a new role for HCD to essentially become sort of a landlord or a project manager for a housing development. They've issued the RFP with the intent of entitling a housing development. And again, the priority is affordable, a range of affordable housing. We are anticipating a project of anywhere from 100 to 200 units. It could be potentially less, it could be potentially more, but we're anticipating within that range. The proposals have various mixes of affordability, but they all include a pretty substantial affordability element, particularly in very low, which is important to the city. We've been in discussions with the state regarding this development. The site is in the county, technically in county land. we were made aware of this at about the time the initial RFQ was being issued. So the state wasn't quite aware of our interest as this is within our sphere of influence. And if developed to this degree, we've expressed a preference that the city would in fact annex the property so it would have urban services for Larkspur. And in doing that, that does have implications for our arena. We're still parceling out what that means because there is designation that was given to the county as this is part of the county area. So there's a sort of a transitional process for reassigning that RENA requirement to the city and then the city acquiring the RENA credits. So the interesting discussion is really how much RENA requirement is reassigned and how much credit do we get. Because the San Quentin site is so large, we're perceptively, it's hard to justify that a significant portion of this was identified as creating a RENA demand. So this really seems to qualify as, new units coming out of the state process. But again, that's something we're kind of working on. The state is currently undergoing their selection process amongst 3 qualified project proposals for developing the property. So do you have any questions on these sites, Ross Valley or?
Neil, it's Kevin, just real quick, just on annexation, and I don't want to make this a long conversation, but it seems like the state's moving forward with their development process, and I'm just wondering how a possible annexation would proceed with that initiative already well underway.
Well, I'll talk a little bit and then I'll probably hand this off to Sky. I think there's a few different options, but what I'm understanding is that what the intent of HCD is to essentially go through the secret process and entitle the project and then hand the site over so that the local agency issues the permits and manages the actual development permitting. We're still
that would require annexation.
Yeah, I think it's premature to answer the question. The RFP leaves a lot of these issues to whoever is awarded the development project, and so I think we don't actually know what the schedule and timeline looks like. We've made it very clear to the state that annexation should be built into that timeline.
Okay. Well, that's good enough for now.
And I think one thing that Sky had recognized is the state, if there's an urgency and an interest in doing it, the state has the capability of, I don't know, maybe Sky, I'll let you kind of describe that option as well, as opposed to our having to actively do the annexation process.
Sure. It's not the most common manner in which jurisdictional boundaries are redrawn, but the legislature actually has the authority to do it itself.
Oh.
As you know, most changes in organization of local governments goes through the local LAFCO, but the legislature can create new jurisdictions, can decreate them, can redraw boundaries. So if this were a priority for the state, they could probably take a bill to the legislature and get this done relatively quickly. I expect that they're probably running into some similar issues with the other projects that they're also surplusing. So it may be something that they want to explore themselves to facilitate rapid reorganization for these sites.
Neil, my question is, in the aerial photo you attached with the document, there's a lot more land out there that is to the east of where this 5-acre parcel is. Do you know why that particular 5 acres was chosen, or is it relevant to what we're doing?
Well, I think I can, the feedback that we've received, because one of our concerns was, is this you know, I think the community is going to want to know, is this sort of the nose under the tent?
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
Developing the larger area. The response from the state has been, you know, the San Quentin facility, the prison is not moving anytime soon. And they do use, and the shooting range remains active.
Yeah.
The shooting range is just over the hill. So they've identified this area as really being surplus because I think for topographically and such, it really is very disconnected from the rest of the San Quentin facility. But the prison has likely indicated, you know, this is kind of the limit of what we need to continue for our operation. In our discussions with them, we also indicated that it may help in the process to be very clear that the further boundary lines and the ridge lines are identified, you know, if this development occurs, they're identified as some form of ongoing open space or such, because that would be kind of consistent with the way that other agencies and ourselves in the county have approached this kind of development. You know, cluster it down where it's accessible, minimize the grading, minimize the intrusion into the trees and the views and the ridge lines. So that's been a very preliminary discussion, because clearly what they've kind of done is taken 5 acres, sort of wrapped it around that bowl and limited the development into there. But there is certainly more acreage as you go up the ridge lines.
I just want to caution Catherine that the more direct answer to your question is we have no idea. What we do know, the state has told us, is that the topography of the 5 acres they've selected is something of a bowl that separates it from the rest of the property. And why they chose that, why they didn't choose any other part of the property is not something we're privy to at this time. So we'd only be speculating.
No, that's fair enough. Then this is just something to keep on top of as we move forward, because it's an opportunity for us. Any other questions from the council? Okay, Neil, you got more for us?
No, that was just that was it. And I think the other thing I did, unless you have further questions, there's obviously a lot on the plate relative to completing the general plan and then begin to initiating the housing element. And when I mentioned the county, the regional effort, the countywide effort for using regional funding, one of the first steps in that is getting a housing coordinator on board, and the county has been working on that. The purpose of the coordinator to be basically the lead on developing the housing elements for all the agencies, all the other cities and towns in Marin and the county, to begin building that framework and working with the other sub-consultants. The ABAG has a whole bench of consultants that they've been developing to then help the agencies build their housing elements and do the demographics, do the analysis, et cetera, et cetera. And the county like a month ago had put out an RFP for this position and did not receive response. A lot of the housing consultants are, the companies that do this type of consulting are already getting pretty busy. So the county is still seeking the coordinator position that then really will help launch us to the next steps there. So I just want to kind of give you that framework of kind of the scramble that's going on with the directors in the county to try to really get this program up and running, given the various funding mechanisms and responsibilities. I've talked with Dan about this, but one of the measures we may take to help get ourselves moving and to help support staff in these various tasks, the housing element, the odds review, any further discussion on inclusionary housing analysis, ADUs. It may help to have a sort of a steering committee, AKA like the steering committee we had for the general plan update, of a couple council members and a couple planning commissioners to bridge both the planning and sort of the community concern issues as a sounding board and sort of a review group to help filter and bounce some of these issues and concepts off and work with the consultants as we begin really, because we really have to begin rolling up our sleeves and tackling some pretty significant issues. And that was I think a very effective process for refining the general plan and getting that resolved. And so that's a suggestion. I do have a couple of commissioners who I've talked with about that. And I need to talk with the whole commission as a whole and kind of present that, but it was something we're considering, and we could formalize an approach if that's palatable for the city council.
Well, we'll work with you on making that happen because we did do it before. Anything else from the council or Neil on this topic? Hearing nothing, and I'm mindful of the time, so let's keep moving along.
I'm going to stop sharing.
So our last topic that before it's open for any questions or direction for future items the council would like to have was just to give you a very brief summary of our preliminary efforts in pursuing initiatives that focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. The city clerk, Alice and I have started doing a research project to collect examples of different initiatives in other cities around the state. And those initiatives are at two different levels. One would be actions that the councils have taken, whether they be implementing programs or adopting policies. And then secondly, we're looking to see what sort of internal initiatives different cities have created over the last several years in this area. I anticipate that in the coming months, we'll start to be bringing some of those examples to you as a council so that you can look at them. Some of the ones that are a little easier in terms of the research are things like amending our purchasing policy to recognize businesses that are minority owned or women owned. We don't actually do that now. We do green-based and local, but we may want to put some other preferences into our purchasing policy. Some cities have chosen to do that. We can look at our investment practices as well. And that's what some cities are doing. All of the Marin managers are arranging to hear some presentations by different organizations that help municipalities look internally to see what their staffing practices and their internal policies and procedures are, to recognize areas where they can be improved. I don't anticipate that we'll be working collectively with other agencies to create specific standard practices because we all need to still recognize our individual communities. But two key things that the managers want to do is make sure we're all using a common language and a common general perspective. And then additionally, to make sure we're all aware of the best resources available. So I expect we'll be hearing some presentations along those lines at our managers meetings in the coming weeks and months. And then lastly, we will be doing an audit. We have talked to a couple of our neighboring cities about sharing some resources to have some internal audits done of our past practices to see if we've unintentionally created barriers to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we're looking now, there are folks that do that to help government agencies. So we're looking to potentially retain somebody to do that sort of analysis for us. Those are the three initiatives we've started so far, and I think they'll be coming to you periodically throughout the year.
Okay,
Yep.
I hear cats screaming in the background.
Yes, he has much to say today.
Well, thank you, Dan, for that, because as you know from our recent conversations and getting ready for this meeting, that's a diversity and inclusiveness is a high priority for me personally, and I'm very supportive of the efforts that you've just described, and want to participate to the extent that I can. Any other comments from council?
I actually would be curious when you're doing this research to also see what cities are doing to reach out to communities to get them to participate more on boards and commissions. As how we can reach out to parts of Larkspur community that hasn't participated before, some of our lower socioeconomic areas, to see if they are, how we can do that better.
Be happy to look into that.
Yeah, I think that's excellent comment. Anything else from the council on this topic? And as I said, Dan, I look forward to working with you and others on staff and within the council to make some good progress on this topic.
So the last item we had was just an open opportunity. If there were topics the council would like addressed at a future meeting, or any general questions you have, we on the agenda enumerated all sorts of topics to give you a wide breadth of opportunity to ask questions. So this is really your open forum opportunity before the mayor wraps us up.
I have one. I'm getting a lot of emails and interest in us as the city of Larkspur becoming an age-friendly community. There are 11 cities and towns in Marin, and there are only 2 that are not designated age-friendly: Sausalito and Larkspur. So I attended a.
I think it might be Tiburon and Larkspur, Belvedere and Larkspur. Sausalito was an early adopter.
Oh, you're right.
Maybe wrong. I don't want to slight Sausalito.
No, you're correct, because they did present at this meeting the other day. So I'm just putting forward that I'm very interested in learning more about this, and I'd like to do some background work on it, and hopefully get some more information, and maybe we can start to see how Larkspur might be able to become a more age-friendly community. So I'm just putting that forward, that I'm going to start really trying to learn a lot more about that.
Mr. Mayor, I have a comment.
Yeah, sure. Go.
Dan Schwartz and Nia and Shannon and the other staff members that worked very hard to put the presentations together for today's session. Today's session, I know it wasn't intended to feel different than retreats in the past, but it did for me, and in a good way. I really appreciated the very specific information, and it was helpful to me because I can only speak for myself, but I suspect that Kevin and Catherine might have similar perceptions. But after having served on the council for 1 or more terms, we're ready for this kind of detailed presentation of information, because it tells us what we need to do pretty quickly going into the year. And I think there were some fairly complex topics, some big moves that commensurate with the challenges we're facing. And I just want to say it felt different than the typical retreat, because it was a little more tight and focused, and really kind of gave direction. And I just want to say I appreciated that. And I think it was very helpful for me and kept me engaged.
No, and thank you for those comments, Dan. I think part of the way things were conducted today is just a function of how we have to do business under the current circumstances. I do personally kind of miss the opportunity to get together in person and share coffees and pastries with folks as we've done in the past. But I really appreciate Dan Schwartz and others on staff to make today's meeting move right along in a very informative way. And I'm sure that view is shared by others as well.
Well, just in going along with Catherine's comments earlier about how the past year required everyone to accelerate into what would become a new way of operating, really. And I just think all that together says a lot about the staff, and I'm really grateful, and we're very, very lucky to have you all here. Thank you.
Best little city in the country. Any other comments, thoughts, observations, parting shots?
Usually at this, sometimes we get the mayor says what their priorities are. Are we usually at these strategic planning retreats, or have we already done that? And
I think now we're going to, we had as our last item was a wrap by the mayor, so maybe he'll add that to his comments.
Sure. You know, just kind of going off of what's already been discussed. I am very proud of our city, and I think there are things that we need to improve on. But you know, we've done a terrific job, and I appreciate so much the work that Dan and Kathy and others have put into maintaining our finances. Hearing the report earlier today, and we're going to have a lot more conversation coming up in the coming months on budgets and firm finances. But you know, the fact that we've been able to get through this year in as good shape as we are financially is really very important to me. And I'm, as I said, I'm very proud of where we are on this. You know, in terms of going forward, I think I've already expressed my interest in improving our engagement on diversity and inclusiveness issues. And that encompasses a variety of different things that I don't think maybe we've all been as aware of as we could be in the past. And I think this year creates an opportunity for us to do that. And I'm very happy to hear Dan's comments about the initiatives that are underway and other things that we're doing as a community to improve that aspect of our community's culture. So as I said, to me, that's a big priority going forward into the future. I think we've made a tremendous amount of progress, and I really appreciate, Neil, your hard work over a long period of time on our general plan effort. I think we started that conversation 4 years ago or something like that, and we're now getting to the point where we're getting close to being done with that, and I think that's great. I do think we have some very significant challenges on housing issues. And dealing with our RENA obligations. And I'm hoping we'll have opportunities for additional discussion about how to deal with that. I worry that, you know, the way the ABAG process has been teed up, we're kind of in in the middle of the concern about how to deal with that issue in Larkspur because of our nexus to transportation hubs and other things. So to me, that's going to be a real challenge in this coming year, and it's going to require a lot more conversation. I'm happy to see the opportunities that may be presented by the annexation of that property over by San Quentin. I'm hoping we'll also have some robust conversations about a transition to being a charter city during this coming year. I'm not sure how long that's going to take, but I think that will provide some significant benefits to us as a city, both financially and in other respects. So to me, those are all good opportunities that this coming year presents. And I'm looking forward to working together with a terrific city council and staff to make sure those things happen. That's it. So those are my comments. Anyone else on the council? I really value the relationships that we've historically had on the city council. I think we have a council that works as well or better than any other one in the county of Marin, if not anywhere in the state of California. So thank you all for your efforts and continued participation. Thank you. And now I'll shut up.
Are we adjourned?
I think we need you to say we're adjourned, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, I am going to adjourn, but I get to use my gavel. I didn't use the gavel early on. So do I hear a motion for adjournment?
I move that we adjourn the meeting.
Do I have a second? By consensus, we are adjourned.
Good job.
Okay, have a good day.